The danger doesn't arrive from outside. It wakes up next door.
Not with noise, but with certainty. You hear it in tone before you see it in action. The way someone talks about shortages like weather patterns, inevitable and impersonal, already priced in. That's the first signal. The moment you realize this isn't about collapse anymore. It's about proximity, and you're already inside it. This is about you, right now. Because when systems thin out, neighbors stop being background noise and start becoming variables, not villains. Not monsters, just people under pressure, shedding the friction that kept them polite. The first threats aren't violent, they're adaptive. They notice faster, they test boundaries while everyone else is still hoping the problem passes. This is where most people get it wrong. They wait for aggression, raised voices, obvious instability. That comes later. Early danger looks functional, helpful, organized. It's the neighbor who volunteers to coordinate, who asks practical questions that feel supportive but land like measurements. They're not asking to help, they're mapping. The mistake doesn't hurt immediately. It hurts when familiarity turns into access, when casual conversations become inventories. When someone remembers details you didn't mean to give, how many people sleep inside, when you leave, what you rely on, that's when the neighborhood starts remembering itself, stitching together a picture without telling you. Remember this, scarcity doesn't create new personalities. It removes friction. Traits that were harmless when systems worked become leverage when they don't. Curiosity turns into surveillance. Generosity turns into obligation. Confidence turns into authority. None of it feels hostile. That's why it works. And it gets worse. Because the first shift isn't violence, it's alignment. Small groups form around shared assumptions, shared fears, shared definitions of fair. Once that happens, you're no longer dealing with individuals. You're dealing with momentum. Decisions begin to feel inevitable. Dissent starts to feel inconvenient. This is the detail people forget. Threats don't announce intent. They normalize outcomes. They talk about shortages as solved problems, solved by excluding someone else. They float hypotheticals and watch reactions. Who nods? Who stays quiet? Who hesitates? Consent begins long before enforcement. The neighbors who become threats first don't look dangerous. They look prepared, decisive, calm in a way that feels premature. They don't panic because they're already moving toward advantage. They speak in trade-offs, in sacrifices, in language that makes loss sound responsible. That's when you should feel the temperature change. By the time you notice tension in the air, the social terrain has already shifted. The building remembers conversations. The street remembers who talked to whom. Nothing resets. The danger isn't what someone might do, it's what everyone has already agreed feels reasonable. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see where the survivors are watching from, and hit subscribe while you're here. Once pressure sets in, the neighborhood begins to sort itself. Not with meetings, not with announcements. It happens the way heat moves through a room, toward gaps, toward weakness, toward opportunity. People drift into roles without realizing they've accepted them. Some become listeners. Some become organizers. Some become quiet. This is the part everyone misses. They watch the loud ones, the angry ones, the visibly unstable. Those are distractions. The first real threats don't raise their voices. They lower them. They collect information instead of making demands. Everything they do is framed as concern, coordination, just trying to help. That tone disarms people faster than force ever could. The delayed consequence shows up socially. Problems stop moving through systems and start routing through personalities. Someone becomes the person you ask. Someone else becomes the one who decides timing. Another becomes the one who interprets fairness. Authority forms before anyone votes for it, and by the time it's visible, it already feels necessary. And it gets worse. Once informal authority exists, accountability dissolves. Decisions get justified after the fact. Mistakes slide sideways onto circumstances or outsiders. Anyone who questions process gets labeled difficult, uncooperative, unsafe. That's when safety language starts hardening into expectation. This is where the reframe matters. It's not the desperate neighbor you should watch first. Desperation is loud and unstable. It burns out. The real threat is the composed neighbor who's already adjusting expectations downward, the one who speaks in trade-offs, in sacrifices, in language that makes loss sound responsible. Remember this detail. Threats don't announce intent. They normalize outcomes. They talk about shortages as if they're solved problems, solved by excluding someone else. They test reactions with hypotheticals. What if we had to, wouldn't it make sense if they watch who nods, who stays quiet, who hesitates? This is where it turns lethal later, because once people accept new limits verbally, enforcing them physically becomes easier.
Consent always comes first. The neighborhood that agrees on who deserves what will eventually agree on who doesn't. The line moves quietly, one conversation at a time. Pay attention to how decisions get framed. When outcomes are presented as inevitable rather than chosen, responsibility disappears. No one feels guilty enforcing rules they didn't technically make. They're just following what had to happen. That's how harm becomes administrative. By the time stress peaks, the threat isn't one neighbor. It's a shared story, a narrative that makes exclusion feel practical and force feel justified. At that point, no one thinks they're doing anything wrong. They think they're being realistic. When things finally break, it won't feel sudden. Sudden implies surprise. This won't surprise anyone paying attention. It will feel justified, explained, framed as the only reasonable outcome left. That's how danger arrives. After the argument is already over. This is where most people get caught. They believe danger appears when resources run out. Empty shelves. Dark buildings. In reality, danger appears earlier, when interpretations harden. When people stop asking if and start deciding who, that's the shift. Neighbors stop being individuals and start becoming roles that can be evaluated, sorted, accepted, or denied. The mistake doesn't show up immediately. It shows up when help becomes conditional, when assistance is offered with expectations attached. When safety is exchanged for compliance, framed as cooperation. No one says it out loud, but everyone understands the terms. That's the point of no return. Once safety has a price, it stops being safety. Remember this, the neighbors who become threats first aren't driven by hunger. Hunger is chaotic. It burns hot and fast. The real threat is certainty. The belief that someone understands what's happening better than everyone else. Certainty is intoxicating under pressure because it removes doubt and it spreads faster than fear. And it gets worse. Certainty doesn't tolerate friction. It seeks confirmation. Dissent becomes disruption. Neutrality becomes suspicion. Anyone who doesn't align feels unpredictable. And unpredictability under stress is reframed as danger. That's how lines get drawn without chalk, without meetings, without anyone admitting it happened. Watch how language tightens. People stop saying maybe and start saying obviously. Questions become statements. Explanations replace discussions. Once language hardens, behavior follows. Not because people want to harm others, but because harm now feels like maintenance. The reframe is uncomfortable. This isn't about good people turning bad. It's about structure replacing empathy. As systems shrink, personal logic fills the gap. Decision-making compresses until it fits inside a room, then inside a person. Morality scales down with it. What matters is what works here, not what's right everywhere. Pay attention to how compliance is rewarded. Those who align early are praised as responsible. Those who hesitate are described as risks. No one is accused directly. Labels do the work. Once labels stick, actions feel justified. You're not excluding a person, you're managing a category. By the time you think to reassess your surroundings, the threat isn't hidden. It's normalized, embedded. It smiles when it passes you on the stairs. It asks how you're holding up. It already knows the answer. The danger isn't that someone intends harm. It's that harm has been reframed as necessary. Collapse doesn't create enemies. It reveals which neighbors were already rehearsing for a smaller world, a world with fewer variables. Fewer voices, fewer complications. A world that feels easier to manage when pressure mounts. Tomorrow doesn't ask who you trust. It checks who decided first. By the time you recognize the threat, it no longer feels like one. It feels like order. Calm replaces uncertainty. Schedules replace improvisation. Someone starts tracking needs, another manages access, another decides timing. None of it sounds hostile. It sounds responsible. That's the trap. Order feels safe because it reduces noise, even when it narrows options. This is where people confuse stability with safety. Stability is predictable. Safety is protective. They aren't the same. Stability can be achieved by constraining behavior until nothing unexpected remains. Safety requires tolerance for uncertainty. When pressure rises, stability wins because it's easier to enforce. This is the part everyone gets wrong. They assume control requires force. It doesn't. Control begins with tempo. Who speaks first? Who summarizes the discussion? Who decides when the conversation is finished? Once tempo is set, resistance feels disruptive instead of necessary. You're not disagreeing, you're slowing things down. The delayed consequence appears in small denials. Requests that once passed without comment now need explanation. Help that used to be automatic arrives with conditions attached. Nothing is written. Nothing is explicit. The tone shifts from cooperative to evaluative. You're being assessed without being told what the criteria are. And it gets worse. Once coordination hardens, dissent is reframed as inefficiency. Anyone who questions priorities is described as emotional. Anyone who hesitates is framed as a risk. Neutrality disappears. You're either aligned or you're a problem. Silence becomes suspicious. Agreement becomes currency. Remember this. Threats mature when people stop arguing about facts and start enforcing interpretations. What's fair? What's necessary? What's for everyone's good? These phrases don't describe reality. They compress it. They reduce complexity until alternatives vanish and decisions feel obvious. This is where it turns lethal later. Enforcement doesn't begin with violence. It begins with restriction. Movement is noticed. Absences are questioned. Privacy shrinks. Not by law, by expectation. People watch because watching feels responsible now. The neighborhood starts policing itself without needing to be told. The reframe matters here. The most dangerous neighbor isn't the one who hoards. Hoarders are visible and isolated. The danger is the one who manages distribution. They don't need to threaten you. They just need to decide when you qualify. Eligibility replaces trust. Process replaces judgment. By the time things escalate openly, the groundwork is finished. The rules already exist. They've been practiced quietly. They've been normalized through repetition. Order arrives first. Punishment follows, framed as maintenance. And by then, most people won't remember choosing it, only that it feels necessary now. Once roles solidify, the neighborhood stops being a place and becomes a system. Places have memory. Systems have rules. And rules don't feel guilt. They optimize. They remove friction by flattening differences until behavior is easier to predict than people. This is where most people get caught again. They believe relationships will protect them. Familiarity, history, shared memories. But systems don't remember kindness. They remember compliance. The moment behavior matters more than identity, the past stops counting. Who you were becomes less relevant than how reliably you fit the pattern. The mistake doesn't punish immediately. It waits until exceptions disappear. Until every situation is treated the same, because sameness is easier to manage. That's when discretion dies. Once discretion is gone, mercy has nowhere to live. You're no longer judged, you're processed. Remember this detail. Threats escalate fastest when resources aren't scarce enough to force clarity. Ambiguity is fertile ground. It allows rules to be tested without consequence, boundaries to be probed without resistance, people to be categorized without confrontation. Scarcity sharpens decisions. Ambiguity blurs them just long enough for control to settle in. And it gets worse. Systems reward predictability. Anyone who acts independently introduces uncertainty. Uncertainty becomes danger. That's how autonomy gets reframed as selfishness. Privacy as secrecy. Silence as guilt. The safest posture becomes visibility on approved terms. Watch how behavior changes. People begin adjusting themselves before being asked. They speak more carefully, move less. Volunteer information to avoid suspicion. Compliance becomes proactive. The system doesn't need to punish often once people internalize the cost of deviation. The reframe is brutal. The neighbor who becomes a threat first isn't acting out of malice. They're acting out of logic. A logic that values stability over people. Once that logic spreads, empathy becomes inefficient. Compassion slows decisions. Slowness introduces risk. Risk is unacceptable. This is where language finishes the job. Words like protocol, procedure, standard. They sound neutral, technical. Objective. They aren't. They lock behavior into place. Once behavior is locked, consequences become automatic. No one has to decide anymore. The system decides, and responsibility dissolves into process. Notice what stops happening. Apologies. Explanations. Personal judgments. Everything becomes referential. That's just how it works now. When harm occurs, it's described as unfortunate, not chosen. That's the final insulation. No one feels responsible for outcomes they didn't technically authorize. By the time you feel unsafe, the neighborhood will feel calm. That's the warning sign most people miss. Calm doesn't mean safe, it means settled. The system is running smoothly, voices are low, decisions are quick, and anyone who disrupts that calm is treated as the problem. Danger doesn't peak when voices rise. It peaks when everyone agrees. In the end, the threat doesn't look like a neighbor at all. It looks like inevitability. By the time you notice it, it no longer feels personal. No one is glaring. No one is shouting. The atmosphere is calm, procedural, settled. Collapse hasn't turned people against each other. It has turned them into functions, enforcers, coordinators, observers. The human element thins out, replaced by process that runs whether anyone believes in it or not. This is the detail people forget. The most dangerous phase isn't desperation. Desperation is loud and unstable. It burns itself out. The danger is normalization. When restrictions feel routine. When surveillance feels polite. When exclusion feels justified because it has already happened a few times without consequence. Normalization is quiet and it lasts. The delayed consequence is internal. People begin adjusting their behavior preemptively. They speak less, they move carefully, they choose routes and words that attract minimal attention. Not because they're hiding something, but because attention now has weight. Being noticed carries risk. That's when the threat no longer needs to act. It has been absorbed. Watch what disappears. Questions, humor, informal movement. People stop improvising and start complying by default. They anticipate what the system expects and deliver it before being asked. The system doesn't need to correct often. Self-correction is cheaper and people provide it willingly once deviation feels unsafe. And it gets worse one last time. Because once people accept the system, they begin to defend it. Not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Fear of losing the small predictability it provides. The rules may be harsh, but they're consistent. Anyone who challenges them threatens that consistency. That makes challengers dangerous, regardless of intent. Remember this. The neighbors who became threats first didn't plan violence. Violence is inefficient. They planned continuity. A smaller, stricter version of life that felt manageable under pressure. They didn't want chaos. They wanted control over uncertainty. Control feels moral when it promises stability. This is where negotiation dies. By the time you understand what's happening, it's too late to argue terms. Negotiation requires equal footing and shared authority. Systems don't negotiate. They process. They accept inputs, apply rules, and produce outcomes. Appeals are treated as errors, not conversations. Notice how responsibility dissolves. No one claims authorship of decisions anymore. Outcomes are described as inevitable. That's just how it works now. Harm occurs without a perpetrator. Everyone is following procedure. The absence of intent becomes a shield, even as damage accumulates. Collapse doesn't turn strangers into enemies. It turns neighbors into infrastructure. People become components in a system designed to reduce uncertainty, not preserve humanity. Once that happens, trust stops being relevant. What matters is compliance history. Tomorrow doesn't ask who you trust. It checks who you complied with first. And the street remembers.